Collector Bro online classes. So today we are going to discuss the current affairs. So today is 4th December 2018 and we will be discussing the current affair that is appeared in the today's The Hindu newspaper. So the first we are going to discuss about the US-China trade war. Now let's get into the analysis. So the news has been taken from the Hindu editorial article that is appeared as Tariff Truce. So let's analyze why this news has been appeared in the newspaper. So recently in the G20 summit or the meeting that is happening in this Buenos Aires, the US and the Chinese president has agreed for a 90 days truce for the trade war that is happening between them over the days. So with this global trade war has come to a welcome pause. So with this we should be analyzing the trade war, how it has been originated, its impact, especially the global impact, and particularly to India. So we will be analyzing all those facts in the analysis. So let's get into the details. And this topics comes under the GS paper 2, the bilateral, regional and the global groupings and the agreement involving India and or affecting India's interest, and further the effect of policies and the politics of the developed and the developing countries on the India's interest and the Indian diaspora. Now, along with this topic, you should also be focusing on the protectionism. So recently there has been lots of discussion that is going on with respect to this protectionism, especially with the America first policy of the Trump, and further the currency war. So what is this currency war, how it will lead to a global financial crisis, etc. should also be discussed. And the further the static topics like trade deficit, balance of payment, etc. should be focused. Along with this, the relevance of the World Trade Organization has also become significant as with respect to this news article. So whether the World Trade Organization is relevant with respect to the trade war and the regional and the bilateral groupings, which has become a significant player in recent times. And with respect to market economy, recently China has been demanding for a market economy status for it. And the recent trade war is also a result of this claim of the China. And with respect to this North American Free Trade Agreement, the countries like Canada and Mexico has come to an agreement with US with respect to this North American Free Trade Agreement. So this also becomes significant. Even though this NAFTA is not directly part of the US-China trade war, it is part of the global trade war. Now let's analyze what is the trade war. So a trade war is an economic conflict that is resulting from the extreme protectionist policies that is followed by some of the countries, in which the state rises to create the tariff or some other kinds of trade barriers against each other in response to the trade barriers created by the other party. So here the America has first raised some kinds of barriers against the Chinese import, and in retaliation China started imposing some barriers and the restrictions on the US import, and this has led to a full-fledged US-China trade war. Now let's analyze the trade war between US and China. So what happened is that in April, US has proposed a 25% of the tariff on the 50 billion of the Chinese goods. So it has imposed a 25% of the tariff, and in retaliation the China has proposed a 25% tariff on the 50 billion worth of US goods, and that is imported from the US. So they have made a retaliatory tariff imposition, and further the US is considering an additional tariff on the 100 billion of the Chinese goods, so which is a bomb and that can blast as a global trade war. So the likely outcomes, which is the trade war, will unlikely, as neither side wants this, because the China is going to lose because of the limited ammunition in the trade war, as imported by only 130 billion of the US goods in 2017, and could US treasury holding or devalue renminbi through the unlikely. So even though this is unlikely, there is a chance for that the renminbi, the Chinese currency devaluation, and for the US also there is a losing side. So the Trump's way of boosting approval rating, and that will lead to a fall in the American economy. Now let's analyze the causes for the recent trade dispute that has led to a full-fledged US-American trade war. So here The first accusation is that China as an autocratic market distorting system. So China is being constantly interfering in its market economy to distort the market system in favor of it. So under this socialist economic system and the autocratic ruling, China's state fed and the Communist Party controls the industries with massive subsidies and have driven vast amount of the overcapacity. So it not only in the sectors like aluminium, steel, but also in other sectors like coal, gas, solar, etc. So and it is moving swiftly into the sectors like semiconductors, robotics, and other high-tech industries, which till now is being dominated by the US and South Korea, etc. So it also aims at foreign market share and bankrupt competitors through the dumping. So this is impacting the countries like India, US, etc. So China is dumping its cheap products in the foreign market in order to create a bankrupt in those countries to dominate the world economy. And further, with all kinds of the market distortion, the countries like US, Japan, Canada, Mexico, and European Union countries are among others didn't recognize China as a market economy. So in a market economy, there shouldn't be any kind of government interferences, but the China is being constantly interfering in its market economy. Then further, the US is accusing the China of the theft of the intellectual property and the trade secrets that is possessed by the US companies. Then the Chinese intelligence service assists the Chinese companies by stealing company secrets. So this helps China to have or dominate over the US companies. And the many countries and companies have accused China spies and hackers of stealing technology and scientific secrets through the planting of software bugs and by infiltrating industries, institutions, and the universities. So this is considered as a encroachment upon the intellectual property rights that is held by the foreign countries. And further, the China also benefit itself from stealing the foreign designs, flouting the product's copyright and two-speed patent system that discriminate against the foreign firms with unreasonably longer times. So the foreign countries take longer time in order to register their intellectual property rights in China. So this is leading to a market distortion or a disadvantage or a discrimination against this foreign enterprises. Now coming to the third accusation, that is forced technology transfer from the private US companies to Chinese state-owned entities. So when the foreign companies is coming to invest in India, the China is forcing them to sell or to partner with Chinese companies. This is leading to a technology transfer to the Chinese companies. So in many cases, the technology transfers are effectively required by the Chinese foreign direct investment regime. So they have changed this FDI policies to support this technology transfer. Then which close off important sectors of the economy to foreign firms unless they enter into a joint venture with the Chinese companies. So they are forcing to close off those important sectors to the foreign companies unless they are entering into a trade agreement with the Chinese companies. And further, the China unfairly controls the imports. The China has instituted an array of non-tariff barriers mean that some critical sectors of the Chinese economy remain relatively insulated from the international competition. So it is a protectionist policy of the China to insulate its economy from the foreign products. Then the China has controlled imports by having a different standard of private and foreign companies. So it is setting a different standard so that the private and the foreign companies cannot function well or to meet those standards, and there will be setback from the Chinese economy, and that will be left to the Chinese industries. And the fourth accusation is that the China unfairly controls this imports, that is limiting both the type and number of companies authorized to carry out international transaction. So it limits both type as well as the companies which are authorized to conduct the international transaction with China, and further imposing the onerous inspection and the safety licensing requirements on imports. This is a non-tariff trade barrier that is being imposed by the China. And further, the developing technical standards designed in part to protect the domestic industries. Also, the China is discriminating against the foreign goods in government procurement. So the government is promoting only the indigenous products when it is procuring something from the private sector. Because of this, the foreign companies is losing a opportunity to sell their product into the Chinese government. Then imposing this high local content requirement on foreign and the joint venture firms producing in China. So this high content requirement on the foreign and the joint venture firms leads to collapse of such firms, as even in the initial stage they cannot procure this much of local content requirements, and when this local content is being procured they become incompetent in the market because the product that the China is selling to these companies are at high cost. Now let's analyze the trade dispute between the US and the China. So the US President Donald Trump had promised in his campaign to fix this China's long-time abuse of the broken international system and these unfair practices. So this is how, when the Trump government has came to power in US, that is leading to a trade war between US and China, and this US has started imposing high tariff and duty on the imports from China in order to address the financial losses or the trade losses that is being happening for the US over the time because of the discriminating policies of the China. Then the Trump administration said the tariff were unnecessary to protect the, so it is necessary to protect the intellectual properties of the US business and to help to reduce the US trade deficit with China. So US is having a large trade deficit with China, which means the US finance or the money is flowing into China. So in order to counter this, the US has imposed a tariff on the China. Then as a result, China has filled counter requirements for consultation against the United States in the World Trade Organization. Also, the China has imposed a retaliatory tariff on US imports. Further, China and the US bilateral disputes have become increasingly intensive. Then China criticizes because of this retaliatory policies or the trade imposition between this country, it has become intensive over the time. Then the China criticizes the US of their export restrictions on the high technology products, their unfair treatment of the China's market economic status, and unreasonable trade sanctions on the China. So because of this high tariff that is being imposed by US, the China is accusing the US of the unreasonable trade sanctions that is imposed on the China, and China is retaliating with the same way. Then the major areas of concerns expressed by the US includes the large number of the trade surplus, relatively ineffective record of enforcing intellectual property rights in China, and this discriminatory innovation policies of the China, and this mixed record of implementing World Trade Organization obligation, etc., acts in against or as in discrimination to the US companies in China. Now let's analyze few of the events that led to the present trade war. So the President Trump placed a 30% of the tariff on the foreign solar panel on January 22nd, 2018, and it will be reduced to 15% after 4 years. So at present, a 30% of the tariff is being imposed on this foreign solar panels that is being imported into US. So why the solar panel becomes significant is because China, the world leader in the solar panel manufacture, degrades of this tariff that is being imposed by the US. And the same day, the tariff of 20% were placed on this washing machines. For that, 1.2 million units that is important during that year. In 2016, China exported approximately 425 million worth of washers to the United States. So in this case also, China has become or is on the disadvantaged side. So this both imposition of the tariff on solar panel and also on the washing machine. So this has acted in or against the China. And following this, the President Trump asked the United States Trade Representative investigating and applying a tariff of $50 to 60 billion worth of the Chinese goods. So the President Trump has asked the trade representative to impose a tariff on this much of trade that is happening or is carried out between China and US. Then the China responded on the April 2nd by imposing a tariff on the 125 products that is being imported from America, and this includes the products like aluminum, airplanes, cars, porks, soybeans, etc. So the soybean has become a very significant here because it has impacted the US agriculture, and that has led to a impact on the Trump administration. And the soybean, which already has a 25% of the tariff. And apart from that, the fruits, nuts, etc. and steel pipings, etc. also invited a tariff from the China. And following this, on the April 5, the Trump responded saying that he was considering another round of tariff on additional 100 billion of Chinese imports as Beijing is retaliating. The next day, the World Trade Organization received the request from the China for consultation on the new US tariff. Then the White House announced on the May 29th that it would be imposing a 25% of the tariff, which is worth 50 billion on the 50 billion of those Chinese goods with industrially significant technology, and the full list of products affected to be announced by June 15. It is also planned to impose an investment restriction and enhanced export control on certain Chinese modules and organizations to prevent them from acquiring this US technology. And the China said that it would be discontinuing the trade talk with Washington if it imposes the trade sanctions. So by this, the trade barriers or the restrictions that is imposed between the countries has led to a global trade war, and all the trade talks between the US and the China has been discontinued since then. Now let's analyze the impact of the US-China trade war. So as the emerging market, it will be having the losers, especially the Asian emerging markets will be having a negative impacts, but the countries like Taiwan and the South Korea may suffer if tariff targets high products, because the countries like South Korea is exporting the high-end technologies, especially the mobiles, tech, laptops, etc. So if US is imposing a high tariff on those products which is targeting the China, then the South Korea and Taiwan, they will also be impacted because of this trade restriction or the high tariff. So let's further get into the detailed analysis, the impact of the US-China trade war. So a simulation that is conducted by the Institute of World Economics and Politics has measured the potential implications of the trade war between United States and China. So this is at the global level. What impact does this trade war between US and the China is going to have? So by using this multi-country global general equilibrium model, the simulation produced numerical values that represent the effects of the US-China trade war. So the simulation found that it indicated that the China will be significantly hurt by the tariff trade or the trade war in all indicators, including this welfare, GDP, manufacturing, employment, and trade. Although there will be definite impact on China, the cost should be maintainable and will not severely damage the Chinese economy because it is vast and is strong. So even though it will be impacted, it won't be a damage to the Chinese economy. With regard to the United States, the simulation produced a result that described that the US will gain on the welfare, GDP, the non-manufacturing products, but it will be hurt at the employment and the trade. So this trade is both export and the import level. The US will be negatively impacted because of the US-China trade war is going on. Since each nation maintains a large economy, their action not only affects each other but also the entire world. Then as a result of the trade war, the simulation predicted that the rest of the world will also be impacted within their own economies. For most large and the developed nations, they will see positive benefits from the US and the China trade war, because both US and the China will now focus to diversify their trade, and they will be coming in contact with the developed nations. So if US and China want to ease their trade with the developed nations, then they have to undergo some kinds of take away of some of the barriers that is specifically they have imposed against this developed nation, and this will act in favor of the developed nations to support their trade or their export into US as well as China. Now let's analyze this impact of the US China trade war on the specific economies. So here, as the trade decreases between the United States and China, the trade will presumably increase between other nations as a result, and because of this the developed countries will be the mostly benefiting, and however the small nations will see a significant negative impact, because any kind of the global trade distortion will be having a negative impact on them, and the world's total welfare, GDP, manufacturing production, employment, export, import, and this total trade, etc., are expected to decrease, since many of these nations are highly trade dependent. So as these are highly trade dependent, any of the distortion that is happening in any of the sphere is going to impact them adversely. Now let's analyze the present truce in the world war. So on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in Buenos Aires over the weekend, the US and the Chinese President Donald Trump and the Xi Jinping agreed to a 90 days truce. So the two countries will try to find an amicable solution to the various problems plaguing the bilateral trade relations, such as disputes over the intellectual property rights, then Chinese state support to the domestic industries, and they will resolve it through the talks over the next 3 months. Meanwhile, the US will refrain from raising the tariff on the Chinese goods worth 200 billion from the current rate of 10% to 25% that will come into force from January 1st, 2019 as planned. So in return, according to the White House, the China will purchase agricultural and other goods from the US. So earlier, the China has imposed a tariff on the soya beans and nuts that is being imported from the US. So in return, the China will be taking away those or easing those restrictions that is being imposed by this Chinese government. So in order to reduce the trade imbalances between the two countries. Then if talks fail, however, increased tariff rates are scheduled to come into force immediately. So we have told that the US is presently holding the 25% of the hike that is coming to force from January 1st, 2019. And if this talk falls, then immediately this is going to be coming in force. Then it is worth noting that the Canada-Mexico has arrived at a comprehensive trade agreement with the US in October. So replacing this decade-old North American free trade agreement. So in this background, the China is also will be reaching an agreement with the US in order to counter or in order to reduce those sanctions that is being imposed by the US. So these are some of the signs that this global trade war that began earlier this year may be cooling down. Now let's analyze the reason for the present truce, or why the US and China is pushing or is strongly coming into negotiation. It is because the temporary trade truce should still offer some relief, as there have been apprehensions about the US-China trade battle bringing global economies growth at grinding halt, and this will be an impact on the both US and China economy. So if the global economy is being impacted, then the US-China economy will impact alike, because they are dependent on this global economy for the export of their products. And further, the signs of a significant slowdown in the Chinese economy and the concerns over the negative impact of the trade war on the American financial market may be played a part of this Trump's and the Mr. Jinping's agreement. And further, probably a sober recognition of the fact that there is no country that is going to be winners or gaining from this global trade war, and both countries will be having a mutual destructions or mutual financial loss. So with this, we are coming to the conclusion on the discussion of this topic, that is US-China trade war. So here is the practice question for the mains. So it states that intensification of the trade war between US and China offers many benefits to the countries like India, but it also poses certain serious threat to our economy. Analyze. So here you should be analyzing the impact of the US China trade war, which is very specific to India. So what will be the challenges that India is going to face because of the US China trade war, and you should follow the a balanced conclusion. So with this, we are coming to the conclusion of this topic. We will be discussing the next topic. Let's get into the discussion on the next topic. So here we will be discussing the economic planning in India. So let's get into the news analysis. So this is based on the editorial that is appeared in the Hindu newspaper, and the editorial states that, or it is heading like make planning fashionable again. So here let's analyze why this has been appeared in the news. It is because the withdrawal of the Indian state from the economic decision making has impacted the industries and the economic growth of India, especially the small scale industries. Now let's get into the detailed analysis. So here the topics comes under the GS paper 3, that is Indian economy and the issues related to planning, mobilization of the resource, growth, development and the employment. Also the topic is relevant for the GS paper 2, that is government policies and interventions for the development of various sectors and issues, and the issues arising out of their design and implementation. So along with this article, you should also be focusing on the topics that is related to planning commission and its dismantling, and the 5-year plan and its analysis. So how or should the 5-year planning is having a different approach towards the industry and the agriculture, so that India would be having addressing those agrarian distress at present we are having, and also an analysis of the Niti Aayog and its functioning, and Make in India. So whether it has achieved its targets, or it is benefiting India to emerge as a manufacturing economy. Now let's analyze the importance of the planning for India. So at the time of independence, India was a backward, underdeveloped country. There was a lot of exploitation of India during the British colonial rule. So this made Indian people very poor, and the aim of the freedom struggle was not mere gaining this political freedom from the British rule, but also to attain this economic freedom from Indian economic freedom for the Indian people from this British rule. And further, the economic freedom implies that the removal of this mass poverty that has prevailed in India, and at the same time, the independence, there was deficiency of the good entrepreneurs who could use these natural resources endowments for the India for its economic development. So this necessitated the importance of the government interfering in the infrastructure investment. So to improve the living standards of the people, it was necessary to accelerate the rate of the economic growth, which needed the financial investment and the better utilization of the available resources. Then it was thought that the private sector lacked the necessary resources and the proper mindset to bring about rapid economic growth. And inspired by the Russian experience, the government has interfered and the planning has been taken as an instrument of the economic development. And this has been adopted to plan the economic development. Then the planning commission has been subsequently set up to prepare this 5-year plan, and which would be the indicated direction to which the Indian economy should move. So in this background, the planning commission and this 5-year plan become relevant, and the resources were to be allocated both at the center and the state according to the plan priorities decided in the 5-year plan. The basic objectives of the Indian planning has been the acceleration of the economic growth so as to raise the living standards of the people. So in the initial years, India has been focusing on the two objectives. The first one is the economic growth and the second one is the self-sufficiency. So for this, India has been given more emphasis on the industrial sector. Then further, various 5-year plans also gave high priority to generation of the employment opportunities and the removal of poverty. This is for the social development and the economic well-being of the all. Now let's analyze the role of the planning in India. So India has, under the Nehru's leadership, inaugurated a strategy for the industrialization of the country since the 1950s, and this involved setting up of the public sector units in diverse areas of manufacturing, research institutions in the cutting edge technologies at the time in space, atomic energy, and some of the higher learning institutions like IITs, NITs, etc. So this all has been focused on taking India into a high research, innovation developed country. So based on the research and innovation, taking or making India a developed country. So this was the priority, and for this, the high-end industries like public sector units and high-end research institutions in the space, atomic energy, and the higher learning institutions like IITs were established. So all these were part of the early 5-year plans. And further, all of this by a poor country which was still struggling to find its feet amidst the multiple blows, and it had to ensure during the early years after the independence. So already the India is being suffering because of the low financial resources, poverty, unemployment, etc. So amid these problems, India has been focusing or targeting the high growth and the high-end technologies. Now let's analyze some of the salient features of the India's planning then. So a Galaxy of Economics has argued that, and many still argues that, a country should focus or it should be developing industries based on their comparative advantages. So when it comes to India, the comparative advantage is a labor surplus. So a labor surplus country like India should also be limiting its industrial development ambitions to labor intensive sector such as garments and leather. But if you analyze, India has been focusing on this high-end technologies and the industrialization even since its independence. Then, by consciously entering into sectors such as machine building and nuclear research, which needed the huge capital and the technological investment, and more critically than labor, India has also challenging this deeply held orthodoxy in the economic theory. That is, in a country should be focusing on this on those sectors which it is having a comparative advantage. And during this colonial period, the British government in India had indeed been putting this theory of this comparative advantage, and which has in resultant or which has become in practice to a disadvantage of the most Indians, which means they will be focusing on this. They focused on the labor of the India, and they focused on this labor intensive, and they have recruited this labor in order to support the high-end technologies they have established in India. And further, the programs launched in India from the 1950s onwards to build indigenous capabilities in capital and technology intensive sector. So despite the general poverty of this country, India became a model for other developing and the third world nations, that is to focus on this high-end technologies for its high economic growth. Then the debate around this Indian planning provided a fertile launchpad for the evolution of the development economies as an important sub-discipline, even though not mainstreaming their development. And further, it will only be reasonable to argue that the foundation of India's diversified economic base had been laid during this planning years. So India has got this strong foundation on the economic sector through this planning years. Then the success that India enjoyed today in information technology and knowledge intensive sector owes much to the research and educational institutions that were built during this early decades. Now let's find some of the criticism or the failures of this India's planning. So planning did very little to remove the hurdles to the growth of the agriculture and the small scale industries. So we have already discussed that in the initial years for the high growth rate, India has been focusing on the industries. And at the lower level, even though India has given some significance to the agriculture, which is not enough. So because of this, the small scale industries and the agricultural were on the disadvantaged side, and they suffered or they were put into a stagnant situation, and the economic growth in these sectors were minimal. Then India's record during this post-independence period in implementing this land reform and ensuring this primary education for all has been rather unimpressive, or India has been failed to implement this land reforms and ensuring this primary education for all. So in the sectors of the land reforms and the social development, India has failed because the planning has not given enough focus on these sectors. Then as a result, the benefit from the state-led development have so far reached only a minorities of the Indians. This has led to the inequality in the wealth and concentration of the wealth in the hands of a few influential sector. Now let's analyze how the government has been withdrawing from major economic sectors or the planning. So India's commitment towards the development through the planning had become to diminish over the early 1990s. So it's much before the planning commission was formally dismantled in 2014. So it was not that the government has been moving away from this planning process from 2014, that is after the dismantling of the planning commission, but since after the LPG reforms, the role of the government has been decreasing in the market, and the government is staying away from constructively or progressively engaging in the market sector. Then after the introduction of this economic reforms in the 1991, the public investment, especially on the agriculture and industry, has been on a decline in the country. Then the public sectors has begun to be valued only for the return, and they bring as commercial entities. So their value as the commercial entities has been lost since after the LPG sector, because this commercialization has been given to the private sectors. Then there has been little recognition of the important role that these public sectors can play as creators of the new technology and knowledge, particularly in the fields in which the private sector may have little interest and the capabilities, especially in those sectors of the education, research in the space sector, etc. Now let's analyze some of the impacts of this lack of planning on the Indian economy. So the disregard for this planning and the general withdrawal of the state from the economic decision making have had an important consequences on the Indian industries. So at present, India today is one of the largest market in the world for a wide range of goods that it produces and the goods that is importing. And it starts from the passengers, car, mobile phones, food products, etc. So a diverse products is coming into the Indian market and is being produced in India also. But despite the emergence of such large domestic market, the record of Indian manufacturing is in absorbing this large labor reserves in the country remains abysmal, and because of this the unemployment still persists in India is at the high level. Then the import of the machinery, transport equipments, then goods and electronics and the other kinds of goods and all their components have been rising continuously in India from 2000 onwards. So this is importing is being promoted rather than the export, which means this make in India or the made in India products is being on the disadvantaged side or is facing some kinds of challenges. And this trend has not been reversed after the introductions of the Make in India initiative. So even after the government has launched this Make in India initiative, the import has been rising and the export has not shown any significant improvement. Now let's analyze how the planning should be in a globalized world. That is, planning is not incompatible with the market and the globalization. On the contrary, a developing country trying hard to stay afloat amidst the turbulences of a global economy requires a more and not less guidance through the industrial policies, which means it should more focus on the planning to strengthen its economy in the globalized world. Then the success achieved by the East Asian economies such as the South Korea in manufacturing are to a great extent as the result of the strategic planning that they have been following over the decades. Now let's analyze the way forward for the India. Then the employment challenges that India faces is close to 15 million. So India has to create this much of employment. So there is no doubt that India should be focusing on the employment generation or the labor intensive sectors, and waiting to be this much of labors is waiting to be absorbed in the industrial and the service sector every year. So is possibly the bigger than that is faced by any other country except China in the world, and it cannot be resolved with the technologies that the foreign companies bringing into India. We our own have to develop some kind of technologies and those industries which can absorb this much of the unemployed youth. And further, what India requires on the other hand are the technological advances that creates new economic opportunities and absorbs and not displaces the labor. And consider for instance the breakthroughs in the biotechnology that may find in new commercial applications in our agricultural products. So this can make the agriculture a employment rather than a distress at present it is being. So on the electrical vehicles and the renewable energy solution also there is emerging opportunities for India. So if India is rightly tapping this, it can become a financial sources and a trade for export for India. So at present India is being focusing or India is receiving large amount of the imported materials as well as technologies from the other countries, which is leading to a trade deficit or is contributing towards this trade deficit and the dependence of the India on the foreign technology. Also, India's research institutions and our public sectors should engage in the creation and disseminations of the such technologies. So from this, the technologies has to be taken to the market and the public sectors should be advanced or has to be developed along with those technologies that is being developed in India. Then the country's industrial policy should be able to enthuse the young and the educated entrepreneurs from the rural areas to make use of those technologies to create new jobs. And for all this, a planning should be brought back at the center of our economic discussion. So with this, we are coming to the conclusion on this topic, economic planning in. Let's discuss the agrarian distress in India. So this news has been appeared in the Hindu editorial as the uneasy fields. So let's analyze why this has been appeared. It is because the last week tens of thousands of the farmers reached in Delhi for a 2-day Kisan Mukti Morcha and held the country's attention. So this has exposed the kind of the grievances or the distresses that the agricultural community or the farming community is facing in India. And this is not the first time that the farming community is conducting such a gathering. Even in Maharashtra, few months back, they have made such a long march, and that also got the nationwide attention. So this has continuously exposing the distress and the discontent among the agrarian sector or the agricultural sector in India. So this comes under the GS paper 3 under the subsection of the major cropping patterns in various parts of the country and the different types of irrigation and the irrigation systems, storage, transport and marketing of the agricultural produce and issues related to constraints and the e-technology in the aid of farmers. And also it is related to issues related to direct and the indirect farm subsidies and the minimum support prices, that is MSP, and the public distribution system objectives, functioning, limitation, revamping and the issues of the buffer stock and food security technology mission and the economies of animal rearing. So in yesterday's class we have focused on the increasing the income of farmers through the non-agricultural and the allied sectors. So that should also be watched along with this video in order to further elaborate the dimensions of this agrarian distress issue. So the farmers has demanded few things. So they sought a special 21-day parliament session, that is to particularly discuss the agrarian crisis. And further, the key demands included an unqualified loan waiver. So at present, it is based on the land and the amount or the return payment that the loan waivers has been given. And this is not in beneficial to these large sections of the farmers. So the farmers is demanding an unqualified or an unconditional loan waiver to mitigate the indebtedness level in the farm households and the better remuneration for their produce instead of promising. So this unqualified loan waiver will be only mitigating if there is an unqualified loan waiver, then only their indebtedness level will be mitigated. So this farm households had better remuneration if they are given this unqualified loan waiver and for their producers instead of promising a paper of high minimum support prices. So which means that the minimum support prices that is offered by the government is not reaching to the benefits of the farmers or is not adequate. And further, the farmers also demanded that this broad demands, that is sum up the precarious the livelihood of the majority of the farmers who work on the small fragmented land holding. So at present, those who are employed in the small and this fragmented land holding is suffering because of the low technology adoption, then high fertilizer cost, then their vulnerability to the climatic events, drought, flood, etc. So because of this, they are facing a huge financial losses and they do not have any of the social security measures to support their losses or their life. Now let's analyze the causes for the agrarian distress in India. So the productivity challenges in the agrarian sector is related to the irrigation. So the low irrigation facility and the low availability of the water makes the agricultural sector unproductive, and the farm holding, as we have discussed, the farm has been disintegrated, and this disintegration of the farming is leading to low farm holding per person. And further, the Indian monsoon, which is the most complex and the most complex climatic phenomena across the world, this makes or this pushes the Indian farmers into the most vulnerable all across the world. Then the subsidies, and we have discussed that the minimum support price or the farm loan waiver that is being imposed or being offered by the government is not getting enough benefits or not reaching to the right hands. And when it comes to the storage or the cold storage or the food processing, which can further act as an income addition or a value addition to the agricultural product, and this is not being adequately developed in India, and because of this the product value or the value of the agricultural commodities is low or the minimal. Then the crop pattern, fertilizer and the soil nutrients. So the high prices of the fertilizers and the crop patterns, which is primarily focusing on this crops like rice, wheat, etc., and those needs the high amount of the water and the high fertilizer applications, etc., leads to huge input cost and the soil deterioration of the soil nutrients because of this fertilizer usage is posing a continuous challenge. So the way forward given in this article includes that in order to address the farmers' distress, the entire agricultural chain is need to reboot, and we need a specific and the targeted policies to address the distresses of the farmers. So here is the practice question for your mains exam. The root of agrarian crisis that India faces today can be traced to the apathy of both the markets and the state to the agricultural problems. Comment. So you can write this and you can comment the answers in the YouTube section. So with this we are coming to the news analysis and the editorial discussion. So thank you.